Econ 4.3, Taxes. Who loves taxes? No one necessarily loves taxes, but taxes are a necessary evil in order for our government to function. And since our government runs the economy through fiscal policy, they are definitely a necessary evil. Why do we have to pay them? Well, we have to pay them because of this document called the United States Constitution. In Article 1 of Section 8 of the Constitution, there lists some very specific needs that the federal government requires money in order to function. Specific tax law came much later, but the foundation was laid in the Constitution. The Constitution allows the federal government to collect a revenue. A revenue is operating money. So revenue is money that you bring in, and it allows the federal government to operate or to employ daily functions, whether that's the Fish and Game and Wildlife, or the FDA, or the military, etc. What does the government do with that money? So the government uses that money to operate or to provide social services. They use it for what we call expenditures, or money that they spend things on. Those expenditures are programs and services like Social Security, the military, the FDA, any other government service that you can think of, including the new healthcare law we know as Obamacare. Defining taxes. In order to understand taxes, and taxes are fairly complicated, we need to be able to define them. So what is the tax base, or who is being taxed based on which factors? Who bears the tax is the first question that you must ask. What is being taxed? What is being taxed can vary based on the need of the government. The government has the ability to provide for and require adults to pay income tax. Some adults file as single, some file as married, some file joint, some file separately. You could ask your parents about how they file their income taxes based on the income that they're paid from their job. Additionally, the federal government and state and local governments can collect a sales tax. That is based on the value of the good or service that the buyer purchases. So it only affects those people and those items that are purchased. In addition, the government collects corporate income tax, which taxes the company's profits. So this is every U.S. corporation from Apple to Bank of America, etc. Every tax base functions under a different tax structure. The tax structure is how a particular tax is collected. There are many different types of tax structures, but we will focus on a few of the very basic ones. The first one is understanding proportional tax. Proportional tax is a tax when everyone pays the same percentage of their income. So for example, if your income is $10,000, you pay 20% of your income, $40,000, 20%, $80,000, still pay 20%. So this obviously varies greatly on the amount that you're paying. So at a $10,000 income, paying 20%, you would pay $2,000, which leaves you with only $8,000 to survive on. Very difficult to survive on that to start with. However, if in making $80,000 you pay a 20% tax, you're still, if you subtract out that $16,000, because 20% of 80 is $16,000, you're still making $64,000, which is a fairly livable wage. That is a proportional tax, where everyone pays the same percentage. Regressive tax. A regressive tax is everyone pays the same dollar amount regardless of income. So let's look at income again. Income again, they would pay the same dollar amount, which would obviously be different than the percentage of their income. So if everyone had to pay a $2,000 tax, so if it was a regressive tax, the contribution would vary greatly based on how much you make. So this would negatively affect those making the least amount of money because they'd be paying the most in taxes, and it would benefit those making the most amount of money. They'd be paying the least by percent in taxes. Which tax base is fair? Well, it depends on what you're talking about. Proportional, regressive, and the third type of tax, progressive, all function in different tax bases. Progressive tax, everyone pays a tax based on their income. Progressive tax is income tax in the United States. The higher the income, the higher percentage that you pay. So for example, this is just a very rough basic estimate. Income of $10,000 would pay 5% of their income, whereas $80,000 would pay 25% of their income. This obviously would vary the amount of taxes that they pay, but more tax is taken out based on the higher income. Can you live off of $9,500 after paying taxes? It would be challenging. Can you live off of $60,000 after taking out the $20,000 from the $80,000 annual salary? Probably. Progressive tax functions most like our income sales tax, as there are several tax brackets, whereas proportional and regressive are much more like sales tax or fixed property taxes. Government spending. So what does government do with this money that they collect in taxes, whether it's from corporate profits, your personal income, or sales tax, or Social Security tax, etc.? They spend it. They use it for programs which can benefit you at certain points in your life. When government spends things, they're what we call expenditures. Expenditures, there's two types of expenditures. Those that are mandatory, those that are required by law, such as Social Security and interest to pay on the national debt. Those are required by law that is passed by United States Congress. Furthermore, the government has what's called discretionary spending. Lawmakers can choose where money should go, and that fluctuates from year to year. So maybe one year they want to give a lot to K-12 education funding, and the next year they choose to give less. So for example, education, defense, research, etc., those expenditures change from year to year, whereas mandatory spending, they do not change from year to year unless there is a change in the law. All government expenditures require a budget that must be planned annually. The budget is created, again, from the last video, by the United States President and presented to Congress. Congress must approve that budget in order for it to become law and therefore be enacted. Altering expenditures and revenue taxes is called fiscal policy, which we went through the last video. When government spends your money, government spends about 60% of the tax money collected on mandatory spending. They spend the other 40% on what we call discretionary spending, or just like in the last slide, how it discussed, that's making choices and changes from year to year. So this is a graph that shows the components of mandatory spending as a percentage of federal spending from fiscal year 1970 to fiscal year 2022. And of course, that's a projection. So, percent of total outlays is percent of total spending. So as you can see, in 1970, total spending, total mandatory spending, that spending that can't change, hovered right around 50%. Whereas it's growing and growing, and currently it's just over 60%. This blue represents the new Obamacare health plan, which will significantly increase significantly, but it's over 60% anyway, increase the amount of spending on mandatory or things that can't change. So that leaves us with a smaller and smaller percentage of money to be spent on discretionary spending each year. And you can see the largest chunk of mandatory spending is Social Security, which is payments to the disabled and the elderly, which hopefully you and I will benefit from as well. Here's a federal budget breakdown. So this is from last year. The federal budget breakdown, Social Security, this is just from last year again. About 20% of the budget was spent on Social Security, and just a mere 2% of the budget was spent on education. We also paid a huge chunk of our budget on interest on our national debt, 6% of our budget. Medicare and Medicaid were 20%. Safety net programs such as assistance to needy families, women, infants, and children, and other social welfare programs were also a large chunk, in addition to defense and international security assistance. Here is a breakdown of state tax money. So in the state of Minnesota, we spend the vast majority of our budget on health and human services, just like the federal government, and we spend smaller and smaller portions after that. However, we spend about 25% of our state budget on K-12 education funding. Vastly different from the federal government spending. When the government spends your money, we can either have, when they create a budget, we can either have a balanced budget, a budget surplus, or a budget deficit. If there is a balanced budget, that means that total revenue, or the amount they're bringing in taxes, equals total spending. A budget surplus, total spending, is less than total revenue, so therefore we're saving money. We have money left in the bank account, so to speak. And a budget deficit is where total spending is greater than total revenue. The last time the United States had a budget surplus was under President Clinton. He had several years under his 8 years of presidency where he had a budget surplus. We've been running a budget deficit under the last two presidents, Obama and George W. Bush. So in the last approximately 10 years, we've been deficit spending because of an economic crisis, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and other social welfare programs which have cost us more and more money each year. What happens when we continue to run a budget deficit? Well, when your total spending continues to outpace your total revenue, fiscal policy would dictate that you would go into debt. When you continue deficit spending, you suffer from debt. If you go to this handy little website, it gives you the United States debt in real time. Here's the debt clock in real time. So this video is made in October of 2013, and you can see that the U.S. national debt is approximately $17 trillion. It can be broken down in all sorts of categories. The red represents anything in the negative, and the green is anything in the positive. And by scrolling over them, you can see the differences. Student loan debt is over $1 trillion. Credit card debt in the United States is $847 billion. Personal debt per citizen is $50,000. That's the average if we took all the U.S. citizens and divided it up. So as you can see, deficit spending is something that we generally tend to avoid as a country, otherwise we run into problems like the government shutdown, debt ceiling limits, etc.